The studio lights were warm, almost comforting, the kind that made everyone look just a little smoother than real life. Reba McEntire sat upright in her chair, ankles crossed, hands folded loosely in her lap, her familiar red hair glowing under the cameras. She had been on television long enough to know the rhythm of a talk show, the friendly banter, the rehearsed spontaneity, the polite interruptions that kept everything moving. The audience clapped on cue, the host smiled for the camera, and everything felt exactly as expected. Joy Behar leaned forward, grinning as she set up what sounded like a harmless joke. It came wrapped in humor, framed as commentary, but when the word, Southern, landed, it carried an edge that sliced through the room. The punchline drew a scatter of laughter, some loud, some uncertain, like people laughing because they thought they were supposed to. Reba smiled too, at first, an instinct more than a reaction, but her eyes didn't change. They stayed focused, alert, the way they did when she listened to a song for the first time and decided whether it rang true. She shifted slightly in her seat, uncrossed her ankles, then crossed them again. For a moment, she said nothing. Silence stretched, subtle but noticeable, like a pause in a melody that makes the next note matter more. One of the co-hosts glanced at her, eyebrows lifting, sensing something off script. Reba inhaled slowly, the way she did before stepping onto a stage, grounding herself not in anger but in certainty. "When you say, Southern, like that," she began, her voice calm and measured, "I don't think you realize how many people you're talking about." The studio grew quieter. Even the audience seemed to lean in. Reba spoke without raising her tone, each word deliberate, shaped by years of telling stories through music. She talked about growing up in Oklahoma, about early mornings and hard work, about parents who taught respect before ambition. She spoke of community, of neighbors who showed up without being asked, of values passed down not as slogans but as lived experiences. Joy chuckled lightly, waving a hand as if to smooth things over. "Oh, come on, it's just a joke," she said, trying to pull the moment back into safe territory. "You know I didn't mean anything by it." Reba nodded once, slowly. "I know what a joke is," she replied. "And I also know when something stops being funny." There was no bite in her words, no raised eyebrow or pointed finger. That was what made it unsettling. She wasn't playing along anymore, but she wasn't performing outrage either. She was simply drawing a line. The cameras rolled, capturing every micro-expression, the tightening of Joy's smile, the stillness of the other hosts, the producer's reflection in the glass behind them. Reba continued, speaking about how accents, backgrounds, and regions get turned into shorthand for ignorance, how easy it is to dismiss people you've never taken the time to know. "I've spent my whole life standing on stages," she said, "and I've seen kindness and cruelty come from every corner of this country. Geography doesn't decide character." The audience clapped, not loudly at first, but with growing confidence. Applause swelled, then softened, unsure whether it was welcome. One of the hosts tried to pivot, tossing out a comment about Reba's latest project, hoping to reset the mood. Reba smiled politely, but the shift didn't take. The moment had already tipped. Joy leaned back in her chair, her tone sharpening just a little. "Well, if we can't laugh at ourselves." "There's a difference," Reba interrupted gently, "between laughing with people and laughing at them." Her voice never rose, but the words landed heavy, each one pressing into the silence that followed. The studio felt smaller. Somehow, the lights harsher. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Reba looked out toward the audience, then back at the panel. She reached up and unclipped her microphone with practiced ease, the soft click sounding louder than it should have. "I appreciate being invited," she said, standing as she spoke, smoothing the front of her jacket. "But I won't sit here and let my roots be treated like a punchline." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A producer's voice hissed faintly through an earpiece somewhere off camera. One of the hosts half rose from her chair, startled. "Reba, wait." But Reba was already stepping away, heels tapping against the floor, each step steady and unhurried. She didn't look back. As she walked past the cameras, the applause came again, louder this time, mixed with murmurs and disbelief. The red, on-air, light blinked, then cut out as the show scrambled to commercial. The last image before the screen faded was Reba McEntire's back as she exited the set, shoulders straight, head held high, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces in a moment that could not be edited away. Backstage, the temperature seemed to drop the moment the studio door swung shut behind her. The applause, the murmurs, the controlled chaos of live television all dissolved into a distant hum, like thunder rolling away. Reba paused just beyond the cameras, one hand resting briefly against the wall as if to steady herself, not from doubt, but from the weight of the moment. A young production assistant stood frozen nearby, eyes wide, unsure whether to speak. Reba offered her a small, reassuring smile before moving on. The hallway buzzed with hurried footsteps. Producers whispered into headsets, voices tight, clipped, urgent. Someone called her name, then called it again, louder this time, but she kept walking. Her pace never quickened. She wasn't fleeing. She was leaving on her own terms. Inside her dressing room, the door clicked shut, and for the first time since the remark was made, the silence felt complete. Reba exhaled slowly and sat on the couch, hands resting on her knees. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror, same calm face, same steady eyes, but there was a depth there now, something resolute and unmovable. She reached up, touched the cross she wore around her neck, and closed her eyes for just a moment. Outside, the show limped back on air. One of the hosts forced a laugh, another stared down at her cue cards, and Joy Behar leaned back in her chair, lips pressed tight. The attempt to recover felt awkward, brittle. Viewers could sense it. Whatever was supposed to happen next had already been overshadowed by what just had. Within minutes, phones began buzzing. Reba's publicist stepped into the dressing room, holding hers up like it was vibrating with electricity. "It's everywhere," she said, equal parts stunned and impressed. "Clips are already spreading." Reba nodded. "I figured they would. Are you okay?" the publicist asked carefully. "I am," Reba replied, without hesitation. "I said what I needed to say." She stood and slipped her coat over her shoulders. There was no frantic pacing, no rehashing of lines she wished she delivered differently. She didn't regret the words, nor the walkout. To her, it felt finished, complete, like the final note of a song that didn't need an encore. As she exited the building, the winter air hit her face, sharp and clean. A small cluster of onlookers and staff lingered outside, some pretending not to stare, others openly watching her with a mix of curiosity and admiration. One woman clapped softly, unsure if it was appropriate. Reba caught her eye and nodded once, grateful. By the time her car pulled away from the curb, social media had exploded. Hashtags bearing her name climbed rapidly, comments pouring in by the thousands. Some called her brave, others called her dramatic. Many shared stories of their own, about being dismissed, mocked, reduced to a stereotype with a smile and a laugh. The moment had struck a nerve far beyond the studio walls. Inside the network, damage control meetings sprang up almost instantly. Executives debated statements, weighed apologies, discussed whether the clip should be pulled or left alone. Joy Behar, alone in her dressing room now, stared at her phone, scrolling through reactions. The humor she'd leaned on for years felt suddenly thin, exposed. For the first time, the joke hadn't landed safely. It had pushed back. Later that evening, Reba sat in her hotel room, shoes kicked off, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. The television was on, muted, showing panel discussions dissecting the walkout from every angle. She watched for a moment, then turned it off. She didn't need the analysis. She already knew what it meant to her. Her phone rang again, this time a fellow artist, then another. Voices from different corners of the industry called not to stir drama, but to say thank you. Thank you for saying it plainly. Thank you for not laughing it off. Thank you for walking away instead of shrinking. Reba listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was simple. "I just told the truth," she said. "That's all." The next morning, headlines framed the moment as a storm, a meltdown, a clash. Reba skimmed a few, then set the paper aside. She knew storms could be loud and destructive, but she also knew they could be cleansing. They could change the air. When she stepped out later that day for a scheduled appearance elsewhere, reporters gathered, questions ready. She paused at the microphones, offered a calm smile, and spoke briefly. She didn't attack. She didn't demand apologies. She talked about respect, about humor carrying responsibility, about knowing when to stand and when to leave. Then she thanked them and moved on. That night, across living rooms and phone screens, people replayed the clip again, not for the shock of it, but for the quiet strength in it. The way she didn't shout. The way she didn't insult. The way she chose dignity over comfort. The show would go on. Television always did, but something had shifted. A line had been drawn without anger, without spectacle, and somehow that made it impossible to ignore. And as Reba McEntire boarded her flight home, she looked out the window as the city lights faded below, feeling no need to explain herself further. Some messages were meant to be delivered not by staying and arguing, but by knowing exactly when to stand up, turn away, and let the silence speak for you.